demons, where do they come from? And why are they the same as fallen angels?
Well, you know, this is one of those topics I get in trouble for, but I'm unrepentant. I don't think demons are fallen angels. I don't think they're the same. And I think it's pretty easy to kind of demonstrate that. I mean, the assumption is we read about demons in the Gospels. And so, you know, we think, well, they had to come from somewhere, even though Scripture never actually tells us specifically where they come from. And so people will go back in the Old Testament and they'll read about what happens in the garden. If they're in the typical Christian church, they probably don't read about what happens in Genesis 6:1 through 4. Mm-hmm. And who knows what they're thinking of when they get to the Babel story. But so they tend to gravitate toward Genesis 3, and they assume, okay, well, if you have, you know, the serpent here, and he's a bad guy, and we have demons plural in the New Testament, they must have all rebelled at the same time, or he's the leader and took a bunch with him. And there isn't a single biblical passage that teaches any of that. Mm-hmm. And people are shocked when you actually say that. And they'll think, well, what about the third of the angels thing? And well, if you go look that up in Revelation 12, it's the only place that language is used. Mm-hmm. That's associated with the first coming of Jesus.
Right, right. So it didn't happen until his birth.
Not creation. Mm-hmm. You know, you have this war in heaven over the coming of the Messiah and all that stuff, which is, you know, pretty important when it comes to the whole battle of good and evil. You know, is the Messiah going to be here or not? You know, is he going to survive or not? And trying to kill him off and whatnot. But you have this gap between the figures you see in the Gospels and, like, where did they come from? Now, in your English Bibles, you get the word demons, typically in English Bibles, occurring twice in the Old Testament. And they're never with respect to a fall. Mm-hmm. Deuteronomy 32:17 is probably one that's going to, you know, show up that way. And then there's a reference in Psalms. And the term is shadim. Mm-hmm. In Deuteronomy 32:17, the shadim are the gods. Again, it turns out, because of tracking through Deuteronomy, they're the gods of the other nations that Israelites were seduced to worship. And they're bad guys. But it doesn't actually describe some sort of primeval fall. There's no such thing as exorcism in the Old Testament. Mm-hmm. I mean, you never have any precedent for this. And here's a kicker. Why did Jews of the day expect the Messiah to be someone who exorcised demons? There's nothing like this in the Old Testament. It's never given as part of the profile of the Messiah for David. You have all these disconnects. Now, all of that to us leaves us in a quandary. And we just sort of ignore the fact that there aren't any real connections, and we just kind of make them. So demons are fallen angels. If you asked a Jew the same question, they actually would have a very clear answer. They would say, well, that's pretty easy, Mike. Demons are the disembodied spirits of dead Nephilim. Mm-hmm. And you go like, holy cow, that's crazy town. I mean, where did you get that? Well, where you get it, again, is the Jewish literature of the intertestamental period that, again, is catching on, latching on, connecting back into the original context of Genesis 6:1 through 4. That's where they get it. They don't invent it. Mm-hmm. They're just aware of it because of the time and place in which they live, and they preserve it in their writings, and some of it leaks into the New Testament, Peter and Jude, that sort of thing. In the Gospels, though, a Jew would take you to the episodes and say, well, hey, why do you think demons possessed people? Mm-hmm. Why did they need to be re-embodied? Right? And their answer is because they were disembodied, because they're disembodied spirits of the dead Nephilim. Mm-hmm. Now you say, well, okay, that's this intertestamental crazy stuff. It's not in the Bible and whatnot. You actually get the spirits of the giants in hell, so to speak, in the underworld, in the Old Testament. Okay, you have references to that in Ezekiel 32, for instance. You have the whole rebel figures, with the Satan figure, the Lucifer figure, Hillel ben Shakar. Again, he's part of this entourage that's in Sheol. You know, the shades, the spirits of the dead come up to meet him. Mm-hmm. The spirits of the dead are dead Rephaim. Mm-hmm. And the Rephaim back in the Old Testament are the giants. I mean, you have these ideas connected together. It's just that they don't occur in one passage in the Old Testament, but they're all there. But in the intertestamental literature, they are all in nice condensed form and specific stories. And so Jews would have been reading that and going, oh yeah, well we know where whoever wrote Enoch, we know where he's getting that, because it's these half dozen passages back here in the Old Testament, plus we know the Mesopotamian backstory to it. Of course. this is where demons come from.
That's really interesting. With demons being disembodied, and that's the reason that they want to possess people, and then it seems like the Bible would communicate the idea that angels, be they fallen or not, still have some sort of body. How does something like the passage where we read that Satan possessed Judas, how does that fit in? I mean, I don't think we're not saying that Satan would be a demon, but how would that fit in with?
Yeah, I'm pretty traditional in that respect. I think that is sort of a direct possession in terms of control, not like I'm going to embody you and now like live in your body for the rest, for a while because I just kind of like that. You don't get any sense of that from the Gospels, but it's a manipulative control.
Oh, okay.
So I think again that's a very traditional way of looking at it. I think that's a good way to look at it. It makes sense, in the context and with what you see after that event happens.
Sure.
You don't get any sense that it's anything more than a temporary, I'm going to use you now as a tool sort of situation.
In our previous discussion, you talked about the Mesopotamian origins of the Watchers, the Apkallu, the sort of wise men who were existed before the flood and then after the flood as sort of hybrid creatures in the Mesopotamian culture. What sort of Mesopotamian literature origin deals with demons? What do we know about demons from those sources?
Yeah, there's actually a lot of it. There are whole bodies of literature that deal with exorcism and possession.
Okay, so exorcism wasn't something that was developed by the Hebrews after the flood. It was something that existed in Mesopotamia, going back prior to the God calling out Abram and creating a new nation.
You have a variety of rituals to deal with, again, what scholars would loosely call witchcraft, and what they mean by that is either positive spellcraft to get rid of a demonic entity. In other words, what do we do in response to what we think is demonization? Or again, something even more extreme, like how do you get rid of them in a more permanent way? There's all sorts of speculative texts about that, and ceremonies and incantations. You actually get a lot of it. Because again, put yourself in the context, for instance, stillborn babies. In Mesopotamia, that tragedy was not treated as a medical problem. They don't know about SIDS, they don't know about X number of things, but to them they associated that with any number of night demons. Lilith would be one of them. It goes all the way back into Mesopotamia, but the night demons come and steal the children away, steal the lives of the children, and so on. So to cure that problem or protect the child, they would naturally consult not with medical doctors. They would go to scribes. They would go to the experts, the knowledge experts, the content experts, and say, hey, what do we do? And they're the ones, again, who are supposed to have inherited divine knowledge, again, from the Apkallu or from some other divine source. And they're the ones that are supposed to be, and they did, write out ritual text. Okay, here's what you do. Here's what you pray. Here's what you say. Here's this thing that you put in your house. Again, to protect you, from the night demon if you have a new child or something like that. So there's just a ton of it, whole genre, in fact, of that kind of literature.
It's interesting because there's such a contrast between that and the example that Jesus shows of dealing with demons in the New Testament.
He never appeals to any incantation.
Yeah.
He never quotes a higher power. He never asks permission. It's just get lost.
Yeah, yeah.
No, literally. And Jews did that. There are these passages in the Gospels and the Epistles about this or that Jew trying to cast out a demon and whatnot. And the question arises, well, what would they have been doing? And why couldn't the disciples do it over here? And, why does Jesus have to correct them and say, well, you need to pray and fast and whatnot? And the answer is, within Judaism itself, there was a lot of the same kind of literature. Again, things that you should do to try to cast out a demon, renunciation texts, and a lot of this stuff has been preserved. And Jesus is like, look, fellas, you don't need that stuff. You're aligned with me. I'm giving you authority, over these demons. The problem is you're just not prepared. You're not dependent on me. So that's why you need to pray and fast, because I have given you the authority here to do this. And I'm your example. Jesus never does anything that a standard exorcist did, other than get rid of a demon. I mean, just get out of here.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much it. I don't need to appeal to a higher authority because there ain't one.
I am the higher authority. Yeah. In fact, it almost reminded me of the rituals that spiritists will use on these ghost hunter shows to try to cleanse a house of negative energy or something. The same kind of thing.
I should say, I work with some people who, on my podcast, we don't use their real names. Fern and Audrey are the names we use for them, and they work with people who've been ritually traumatized, either satanic ritual abuse or some other form of abuse. And their method, they don't use prayers of renunciation. They don't do deliverance ministry. In fact, they come out of deliverance ministry because they have found that when you try to do things that way and it doesn't work, then the victim, what they would call the survivor, is left to conclude, I did something else wrong. Mm-hmm. This would have worked, but I made a mistake again. Or, the blame comes back to them. What they actually do is, the best way I can put it is, they speak truth to lies. Mm-hmm. And we don't really care what the source of the lie is. We don't care if it's an entity. We don't care if it's a person. We don't care if it's somebody possessed or in their right mind who's just evil, who has convinced you that you deserve to have this happen to you, or that God has abandoned you, or that God wanted you, to go through this. You need to stop believing lies. And they actually use theology. And it's not just quoting,
a concept.
Right, it's not just quoting verses. They're very theologically astute, and they know, because, again, one of them is a survivor, and a long-term survivor. They know how the mind is altered and programmed to believe lies. And that's what they do. We need to convince you that you just don't have to believe lies anymore. And here's why. Here's what the Lord did for you. You need to be reprogrammed theologically so that you stop believing lies.
About 10 years ago, you referred me to a deliverance minister who's since gone home to be with the Lord. And he wrote a really interesting essay, which has been updated since I first read it. Looks at the spiritual conflict, this direct face-to-face, rubber meets the road spiritual warfare, and references the struggle between Michael and Satan that Jude writes about in his epistle, where they struggled over the body of Moses. And Michael didn't presume to make an accusation against Satan, but just said, the Lord rebuke you. Mm-hmm. And this gentleman said that they found through their research that there were times when engaging a spiritual entity in the wrong way invited retribution, not just upon the person who was being oppressed or possessed, but also upon the deliverance minister and his team, leading him to conclude that there may be some cosmic legal framework that we don't really understand, and legal rights or perhaps spiritual ranks, if you will, of entities. Do we get any sense of that from the Bible? What can we conclude about the nature of the spirit realm and these entities from the text?
Mm-hmm. There's something in scholarship called the lawsuit genre. It's actually a genre where people of the day, writers of the day, would have known how legal complaints and processes work, just like we generally do. And the prophets especially, but you'll also see it in wisdom literature and in New Testament as well. And often in divine council scenes. Psalm 82 is an example here, this divine courtroom setting, where the content of the passage will be structured and vocabulary will be used to telegraph to the reader that somebody's on trial here. And so God could be both judge and jury. I mean, different parts of the play. I mean, you just have to sort of know what the structures and what the vocabulary are. So there's a lot of that in there. And so there's a sense where there is a litigatory process. There's a pecking order, especially in relationship to the
pardon
judge.
The pun.
Yeah.
Thanks, Derek.
That is very ancient. And I think that plus, and again, I'm not saying there's a one-to-one correlation here, but that plus some of the terminology that's used lend itself to the answer that even though we're not explicitly told what the pecking order is, there is nevertheless a pecking order. you know, we began our discussion about, you know, angels not being demons. Well, look at Paul's vocabulary. One of the two, you know, Old Testament references to demon was Deuteronomy 32:17. Paul quotes that passage in 1 Corinthians 10:21 and 22 about, you know, be careful that you don't eat the meat sacrificed to idols because you don't want to be in fellowship with demons. And he's quoting, through that passage, he's quoting Deuteronomy 32 in several places. So Paul does talk about demons, but look at the rest of his vocabulary. Okay.
Principalities, powers, thrones, dominions,
Right.
rulers.
They're all geographical dominion terms that if you trace them back through the Septuagint, Greek translation of the Old Testament, you're going to wind up in passages like Daniel 10, and you're going to wind up in passages like Deuteronomy 32, the division of the nations according to the sons of God. So these entities are different than demons, because if you think about the Old Testament were, you know, again, scattered in 6 different places. You have demons, the denizens of hell, so to speak, are the disembodied spirits of the giant clans, the Rephaim. And again, Second Temple period is big on that. They fully develop that thought. Well, those guys aren't these other guys. Okay, the ones that are, you know, in hell, so to speak, bound in chains, are either the offending sons of God of Genesis 6, or again, their offspring who are sent back, you know, who can come and go, but the other ones are in jail down there. Well, the gods of the nations aren't down there. They're never described as being down there. They're something different. So if you just pay attention to terminology, you get the idea that, okay, there's these guys over here, and I personally think that even though they hate the same things, God and believers, they aren't necessarily fighting for each other. They're free will beings that you know, could have a divided agenda here, or don't like the pecking order, or whatever it is. You know, Peter and Jude use the term celestial ones, which is a term that in that literature is, you know, those writers, Peter and Jude, are linked to archangels. So in theory, Michael, okay, could have been at the same level as, you know, Satan, who is, you know, one of these. He's not a demon, never described that way. He's a fallen, you know, son of God, a fallen Elohim. So he outranks the demons, who are sort of secondary. You know, I don't know, for a lot of people would not have read the Portent, but I have this line in the Portent where the villain, you know, who is more than a man, okay, says in one confrontation, he says, demons are like puppies. They come when they're called, okay, but I do what I want. You know, there is this sense of hierarchy that you get from the text, even though we don't have it all spelled out. You can't build the flow chart like you'd want to, but you get indications that there's something going on here. There's rank and there's hierarchy. There's differentiation in power and status and whatnot. Because, you know, look at what Jude says and Peter. Look, even the angels don't dare bring railing accusation against the celestial ones. They know when they're outranked. Again, angel is just, it's a low-ranking job description.
And in the English term doesn't really convey the sense.
No.
There are different terms in the Hebrew and in the Greek that indicate different types.
If you just
or
go
ranks.
back to divine council typology, and I discussed this in the unseen realm, where you have, you know, in the biblical version, you have the triune God at the top, you have sons of God in the middle, and sons of God is a term that would be used in ancient Near Eastern royalty for sort of the inner circle, the family circle. You give the most important jobs to family members, again, for a whole range of reasons. And then the rest of the task force, the rest of the household, are just errand people. You know, they're staff people, messengers. And that's actually what malach, angel, angelos, means. So angel is actually a job description. It's a thing that a given divine being is tasked to do. Take a message, receive a message, whatever it is. But the big boys, okay, the ones that get the jobs that matter, okay, governing territories, are not them. They're sons of God. They're the second level underneath the head. So a lot of that thinking, that royal household thinking, is where this terminology comes from in the Old Testament that gets applied to the hierarchy of the unseen realm. To an ancient person, they would have understood this, you know, transparently.
Yeah, I remember when I was growing up in a Baptist church, you know, we were always taught that the rebellion happened, you know, thousands of years ago, and it's all done and over with, and whoever's chosen sides. But the more that I look into the Bible and do these kinds of studies on angels and demons, I'm not so sure if it was just one event that happened and it just doesn't happen anymore. So I wanted to ask you, can angels still fall even today?
Well, I think the answer to that is yes, and I base it on a couple comments in Job. I mean, there's certainly divine rebellions. There's a single entity that rebels in Genesis 3. There's a bunch of entities that rebel in Genesis 6. You know, when you get to the Babel event, you have, again, sons of God who are supposed to be working for Yahweh, supposed to be loyal to him, part of his heavenly host. They get appointed and they go astray. Okay, in Psalm 82. In Job it says, you know, 2 times that the Lord Yahweh does not trust his holy ones. Now you could read that, it's Job 15, Job chapter 4. You know, you could read that and say, well, that's hindsight. You know, God knows that, you know, well, they mess up because, hey, you know, they're really intelligent, they're smart, they're like God, but they don't have his nature, so they mess up. You could read it that way, or you could read it as more of a declarative statement. God doesn't trust them because he does know that this has happened. There's no promise that it will never happen again. In other words, he knows he has to keep his eye on them because they have free will. That's one of the communicable attributes. And they can do what they do, and they've done it before. So I don't think that the door is closed on that.
Yeah.
We just have a couple of minutes left, but you mentioned The Portent, which I should have been pointing out all along at the beginning of the program, is one of your novels, the follow-up to The Facade, which basically follows the same storyline, same protagonist. You mentioned Fern and Audrey, and they were guests on the Naked Bible podcast some time back, and they described an incident, and again, with just a couple of minutes to go, where they encountered a high-level spiritual entity, and it was not as easy to remove as the ones that they had encountered in the past. You just, with a couple of minutes, share that encounter and how they finally got it to go.
Yeah. They again, they're not exorcists. They're not deliverance ministers. Most of what they do is evil done to people by other people, but occasionally they run into something more. And this was an episode where they told me we just tried everything that we thought would work. We quoted scripture, we sang songs, we did this, that, and the other thing. And she said finally it or he started to act out, kind of, like, are we in trouble here? Or is something going to happen to us? They felt that they were really in harm's way. And so they literally used the language, of Jude and said, "The Lord rebuke you, watcher." They instead of a celestial one, which is the Jude language, they swapped in watcher, because she said that's all I could think of, and that line is from the book.
Right. There's a critical scene
in the book where there's someone who is absolutely defenseless, because they're a quadriplegic in the book, but this guy is sort of the spiritual center, and he dispatches. I mean, he's totally dependent on God because he's got nothing else. And he says, "I know who you are. I've seen your kind before. The Lord rebuke you. Watcher." And he names him, and that was just it. Fern and Audrey said he just threw a fit and sat down.
Yeah,
and that was that.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mike, the conquest of Canaan, is Yahweh, the God of the Old Testament, just a genocidal maniac as skeptics will claim?
Yeah. That description always suggests that it's indiscriminate. There's no sort of rationale for this.
Caprice.
God wakes up one day, he's bored, so who do I kill?
Yeah.
Why not? Let's just kill more than I did yesterday. All these caricatures, again, of God, very convenient. What I'm trying to do in Unseen Realm, I spent a few chapters on this, 3 chapters, on the whole concept of, harem, which is, holy war, but harem means to devote something to destruction. In other words, it's a specific judgment passed by God on a particular place. What I'm trying to do is show people that, hey, novel idea here. There might have been a theological rationale for why these commands were given, and there might be an actual context for the wars of conquest when it relates to this stuff. And lo and behold, there is. If you actually look at the conquest account, it's not just killing. there are actually 4 or 5 different verbs used for the conquest. In other words, Israel, this is what you're supposed to do. There's dispossess, there's drive out, there's expel. In other words, there's non-killing terminology. Now, the killing terminology, haram, again, to devote something to destruction, if you actually look where that term is used, it's used not very frequently, and other verbs of killing, again, very infrequent, and they all happen to be used in the same places, in the same episodes in the account. And that place is the hill country. And you say, well, who cares
So when you say
about
same
the hill
places,
country?
you're not talking about the text. You're talking about, you can take a map
Right.
of
You
ancient
can
Canaan
take-
and say,
you can
these
take
are
a
the
map.
tribes that Joshua was
Right.
told to go in and...
Right. Here the account tells us they went to this place, this region, this location, this city, and of course telling you where the city is located. And this is where Haram happened. Okay, and if you actually, again, plot those out, and then you overlay that with where were the Anakim spotted in the land when the spies went in to reconnoiter the land, guess what? They overlap. This is why, again, if you think about the conquest as including Moses and Joshua, you go back into the book of Numbers and book of Deuteronomy, the conquest of the territory that God wanted to give to his people actually begins and ends with giants, with the giant clans. In the case of Moses and Joshua, remember they go up the other side of Jordan, and God actually tells Moses, look, you don't have to worry about what's going on in Edom or Ammon, because the descendants of Esau already took care of the Amim and the Zamzumim, and these were the descendants of the Anakim, great and tall people like the Anakim. And the Anakim, Numbers 13:33, are from the Nephilim. So God's saying, look, you don't have to worry about this, but there's still some of them left way up here in Bashan. And that's where he sends Moses. They go to confront Sihon and Og, the king of Bashan, the Amorite kings. Amorite, the book of Amos, chapter 2, says the Amorites, were as tall as cedars.
cedars, right,
It's the same thing. So that's where the conquest begins. And then, of course, they wind up getting into Canaan under Joshua. And then you have the Harem command, the killing commands, wherever they occur, are in these places where the spies earlier had said, hey, we saw the Anakim in the land, that's why we're scared, we can't do it, and that's why we get the 40 years of wandering. At the end of the conquest, how does Joshua define victory? In Joshua 11, quote, there are no more Anakim in the land.
Yes, yes.
So from beginning, during, and after, the annihilation is not indiscriminate. God's not saying, I want you to go in there and kill everybody that you run into. What's happening here is they're targeting certain bloodlines, certain groups. And in what they're thinking is, look, these guys, these unusual people, they are descended from something really bad, what happened in Genesis 6:1-4, which again, if you go back into the whole theological thinking of the Israelite, these people are here to prevent Yahweh's children from having their possession, and if possible, to exterminate Yahweh's own children. So you have the gods versus God.
Can I ask you a question about that really quickly? In Genesis 6, was that the actual reason? Was it to pollute the bloodline so the Messiah could not be born, or was it more than that?
I actually tend to think that that's not the reason, but it was a result. In other words, it's sort of a residual effect. Because you never read in Genesis or intertestamental literature that, hey, the reason they're doing this is to cut off this messianic promise and whatnot, but had it gone unchecked, that would have been the result anyway. So if you're looking at it from God's perspective, which sort of counts, then you look back on this, and we have to intervene here. We have to preserve Noah. We have to get to the other side of the flood. We got to do this, that, and the other thing, because he again has this plan in his head, whereas maybe the writer doesn't know the whole picture, the reader doesn't know the whole picture, that sort of thing. So that would have been a problem. Okay, it would have been a problem.
So the Anakim were descended, or was there another incursion?
This is the whole question of how do you get, Anakim after the flood and all that. There's basically 3 possibilities for that. I didn't invent these. This is an old question, as you can imagine. So one view actually does include Noah and say, no, not Noah himself, but maybe not his sons, maybe their wives, or something's going on there, so you can sort of have Noah's line okay, but not okay, that kind of thing. So there were ancient writers who would actually take that view because they're asking the same question. How does this work? There's even one text that has Noah himself as a giant, you know. So that what that tells you is that they're thinking about the problem and they're writing stuff about it.
There are some programs that will just run with that and say he's from another planet.
Yeah. So we all know what that is.
We don't need to name it.
So you get that. The other possibility is that the flood was not a global event like we think of it, because the world to the ancient person was Genesis 10.
Right.
You know, Australia's not on the list, North America's not on the list. Well, the world to them is this, you know, Mediterranean, Middle East kind of thing. And so maybe it was regional. Maybe some of them survived. And the way you get that is the Philistines, to be honest with you, because the Philistines are said by Jeremiah to come from Kaftor, one of the sea peoples in ancient Egyptian texts. And the Philistines are also named in Egyptian texts, the Peliset, you know, okay? So maybe they, since they're sea peoples, maybe you get some later. Okay? The third view is that in Genesis 6:4, where it says, you know, the Nephilim were upon the earth, you know, in those days and also after. And then most translations have when the sons of God came into the daughters of men. But you can actually translate that grammatically, whenever.
Oh.
Okay, the sons of God came into the daughters of men. So that it doesn't state that there were other events, but it leaves the door open.
That's a huge difference.
Now here's the other factor. I think in Paul's mind, that was a possibility. I don't think Paul stated it, because if you go to 1 Corinthians 11, and again, the whole head covering issue is, people want to get into that.
Oh, because of those who watch,
Right, because of the angels.
Right.
And so, again, we don't have the time. It would take a whole hour to go through what's really going on in the head covering passage, and it's very sexual in nature because of, again, the Greco-Roman terminology. The terminology Paul uses there comes out of Greco-Roman medical texts. And it has something to do with fertility and fecundity. Surprise, surprise, you know, Genesis 6.
Right.
So the advice he gives there, you know, does have to do with modesty, but then he throws in this little line, well, we want to be careful about this because of the angels. So what it tells you is that, at least in Paul's mind, we really don't want this to happen again. So that tells you that maybe he was thinking it could.
Yeah.
So it gives you a little insight into what he's thinking that goes back to this question.
Interesting.
Oh, yes,
Interesting. So what is the full context of the word harem? I mean, English is not a very precise language when it comes to understanding some of the nuances of the Hebrew. What does harem mean? Why would God tell Joshua, don't leave any other animals alive?
Yeah. Harem was a term that you could use of people, animals, even inanimate objects. Okay, the whole episode with Achan. Okay, the sin of Achan, taking the things out of the tent and burying. All of that stuff was harem. It was devoted to destruction or devoted to God. Now, they could destroy, you know, inanimate objects. They could burn them, for instance. But the larger idea was that I am taking dominion over these things. And as the creator, as the owner, and as God, okay, I'm going to determine what to do with them. We will not use these things to bring, you know, some other kind of sacrifice if it was an animal. Okay, we are not going to allow you to intermarry with these people because of this bloodline thing going on. These inanimate objects, either we keep them isolated from the other sacred objects, or we're going to destroy them. In other words, God asserts his dominion and ownership, his right to essentially say life or death, you know, on this particular object that's named. So it was, in that sense, kind of an object of you could use the term worship in the sense that we are giving this over to God. We are not assuming any right to ownership or any right to make a decision about this thing. This is God's domain. We're staying out of it, you know, because that's what God wants done. There's no latitude here. So it was something totally dedicated, totally given over to what God wanted to do with something, his verdict.
Inanimate objects, could that also apply to land, geography?
Yeah, you had, again, once the land was, you know, quote unquote purified. In other words, you get rid of the problem of these bloodlines who want to exterminate you. In other words, you're fine if you drive out the other people, okay, because this is the land I'm giving you. You don't have to kill them, but this is a different matter because of why they exist. So this needs to be taken care of, and until it is, then that land has not been brought under dominion. It's an incomplete conquest, that idea. So, you know, you go into these, again, these regions, these cities, whatever, and this is the logic the theological logic of why God is dictating this. It's not indiscriminate. It's not random. It's not, hateful. It's life or death. I like to say it this way, to an atheist, look, now you're telling me how horrible it is to worship a God who would do this in any regard. Okay, well, I think you're a hypocrite, and here's why. I want to sit with you in your room, in your child's bedroom, and I want to hear you tell your child that, look, if an intruder comes in, if a burglar comes in, I just want you to know that mommy and daddy won't do everything possible to protect you. Mm. Okay, we won't, if this person's going to kill you, we won't even kill them. We can't do that, and we're sorry.
Yeah.
Okay, no, I told my kids, look, if it ever comes to anything like that, I will do everything in my power to protect you, because your life takes precedent over theirs. Mm-hmm. So I want to hear the atheist either lie to his kids or give the kids that message, okay, that you're not this important to me. Mm-hmm. And I think they're hypocrites.
You made a really interesting illustration of the reason that God, Yahweh, had for ordering or dedicating to destruction these bloodlines, these giant bloodlines, the Anakim, Rephaim, Nephilim in the Old Testament. Why were they seeking to do harm to the Hebrews? Was there a cosmological tug of war, power struggle taking place in ancient Canaan?
Yeah, I think when you get, especially after Babel, you sort of have, we've talked a little bit before in other episodes of Skywatch about how, an Israelite would have been thinking the world is the way it is because of the fall, because of what happens in Genesis 6, and then what happens at Babel, when the nations are punished by God for disobedience at Babel and assigned to, the sons of God, lesser gods, lesser divine beings that in the beginning, God would assign them roles. I'm not going to have a direct relationship with the nations. I'm going to go make my own Israel over here in Genesis 12, right after Babel. But that relationship deteriorates, we're told in Psalm 82. They become corrupt. They don't rule the nations according to the good laws of the true God. They manipulate them. They abuse them. All of that sort of is a maelstrom, kind of a maelstrom of events, where now when you get into the conquest, you have this territorial domain situation in place, and you've got that level of rebellion, but now you've got, again, descendants, from the Nephilim as part of the picture. And so it sort of marries the two. It marries this bloodline thing with the territorial dominion, and now when Israel comes tromping through these other territories, it becomes an us or them kind of thing. So it has degenerated to the point where God knows that, look, these particular people, okay, they were raised up by rival gods, sons of God, rival divine beings, who they're hostile to me and to you, naturally, because you're mine. And so they're superior in terms of who they are and their military might and all this sort of thing. They are the number one threat here. They really can. It is within their grasp to exterminate you. And so this must be taken care of. And it just sort of degenerates from that point on. It becomes a war not just of expulsion. Because when it comes to, again, there's more than one verb, for the conquest. It's not just killing. You can drive a bunch of them out, and we're okay with that. But when it comes to these, you can't let them remain, because they will be back. And if you think about it, when Joshua defines the end of the conquest as saying, hey, there's no more Anakim in the land, he adds the little phrase, well, those that are left ran off into the cities of Gath and Ashdod.
And of course, Gath is where Goliath.
That's where we get Goliath.
Yeah,
okay?
exactly.
So in other words, these are the 5 cities of the Philistines. He mentions a few of them there, and that's where you pick it up again. Now, granted, you're not going to have one guy, exterminate Israel, but it's the idea of, okay, this is a task that is incomplete, and frankly, if he kills David, I mean, let's think about that.
Yeah.
No Messiah.
Because, well, we have this, again, in the mind of God, okay, we don't have King David yet, we don't have the Davidic covenant yet and all that stuff, but again, in the mind of God, this is the man after God's own heart. And so it becomes, it really ups the ante in terms of the theological level of what's at stake in this confrontation. And lo and behold, it just happens to be with one of these descendants. You know, again, that's deliberate. So that what I try to get people to realize is that these aren't just random stories put together randomly, placed in the Bible randomly. There's an intelligence that goes into them. There are plots and subplots that run through all the way back to Genesis. These are actually just continuations of something else. And you know, the biblical writers expect you to get that. They expect you to know that. And often it escapes us, but they're there for a reason, and they're there to perpetuate an idea. And again, the theological messaging is really significant.
Well, let me ask you a question, and it just occurred to me, I don't know why I never thought of this before. Why didn't God just go in and wipe them out?
All of them
He could have done it in a snap.
Yeah, well, he could have.
Why leave it to Israel to do it?
I think this is a pattern with God that occurs both in the supernatural world and the world of men, the world of humanity. And that is, you know, God creates intelligent beings who are like him. They share his, you know, the theological term is communicable attributes. You know, humans have communicable attributes without. Well, that's nice, but so do divine beings. This is why you get the plural language in Genesis 6, or not Genesis 6, Genesis 1:26. Let us create humankind in our image. And then when the creation happens, it's only God doing the creating, but he's speaking to the audience. And who's the audience? Well, it's the sons of God, Job 38. They were
divine
there
council.
Yeah,
Yes.
divine council. They were there when this whole thing was happening. So God creates intelligent beings, and yeah, he could do that. But the pattern with God is he likes to have the beings who are like him participate with him in doing things. We have divine council meetings in 1 Kings 22, where God allows the members of the spirit, you know, beings there decide, okay, how do we get rid of Ahab? Okay, in Daniel 4, the decree, you know, the Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It says in the text, this is by decree of the watchers,
Yes.
plural.
Yes.
Yes.
And it also says it's by decree of the Most High, so it's a joint decision. Daniel 7, the court sat, the council sat, and judgment is rendered on the four beasts. Okay, it's just a pattern. God likes to have the intelligent beings, his family members, so to speak, divine or human, do things with him and for him, participate in the decision, to participate in how history is propelled. So I look at this as just another one of these examples that, you know, I'm not going to do everything for you. I want you to do it with me. I'm going to cooperate with you. I'm going to fight for you. But you are part of this. You're not just sort of a stage actor and I'm going to do something and now you just reap the benefit. You are part of the story, really. And so you have to play your part.
That's incredible.
Yeah. I want to come back to Psalm 82 here and just see if I can summarize this. After the Tower of Babel event, God delegated his 70 sons, the B'nai Elohim, as judges, rulers over the different nations that he divided. Divided the nations, counted them according to the number of the sons of God.
Yep, Deuteronomy 32:8.
Right. And then for whatever reason, some or all of these decided to set themselves up as gods themselves, got a little taste of power, liked it, and decided that they were going to rule not as God's agents, but instead of God.
Yeah, rivals. Yeah.
Psalm 82 then, is that the scene where God calls them back together and says, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, in the beginning, again, the famous first verse, you know, God stands in the divine council in the midst of the Elohim, midst of the gods, he passes judgment. Then verses 2-5 is, why am I angry? And again, it's this whole kind of a courtroom scene where he's angry because of the way they've dealt with people. Okay? You know, Paul has this interesting comment in Acts 17, you know, part of the Mars Hill thing, where he refers back to the fixing of the boundaries. Again, it's back to the Deuteronomy 32, the Babel event. And in Paul's mind, again, he senses that, well, he actually says that God did this so that someday, you know, people might, you know, recognize who he was and be brought back into faith and all this kind of stuff. So it has a redemptive purpose. That's why Israel was supposed to be a kingdom of priests. You live a certain way, you're going to attract the nations back to me. They're going to voluntarily come back. And I actually think that's part of the problem, because instead of Israel trying to attract the nations back through, you know, the Abrahamic covenant, through you all nations of the earth will be blessed, I think the gods of the nations see this as part of the plan. It's like, no. They're ours now, and we're not giving them back. And you get this rivalry situation going on, and you get abuse. And by the end of the psalm, because he says, look, all of you are sons of God. All of you are sons of the Most High. You're all Elohim, but you're going to die like men. And then the last verse, the psalmist says, rise up, O God, and take back the nations. Take the nations. So he wants this to happen, but it's an eschatological feel to it. It's actually part of a bigger theme in biblical theology that scholars refer to as the death of the gods.
Death of the gods.
Right. In other words, when the other gods finally get what's coming to them.
Yeah.
Now, in biblical theology, it's always associated with the day of the Lord, or themes like resurrection, tribulation, Messiah, all these sorts of things. Because, again, if you look at the New Testament, and I'm a big proponent of, and again, this isn't unique to me, but already but not yet eschatology. The things have been initiated and launched, and they're in process, and then they're going to have a consummation. And you get this tribulation, day of the Lord language all the way through. And not coincidentally, it coincides with the beginning of the body of Christ, the church, the quote-unquote new Israel, where now we have the people of God here, and the gates of hell will not be able to, withstand it. So as the church grows, incrementally, the powers, the principalities and powers, geographical terms, geographical rulership terms, thrones, dominions. This is the language Paul uses. They lose their turf. Okay? It's a progressive losing to them that's going to culminate, again, in things like the scenes we see in the book of Revelation and elsewhere. But this is actually part, what you read in Revelation is part of a whole complex of ideas that goes back to this desire to see the gods judged.
We just got about a minute left here, but something occurred to me. In fact, we talked about it in our weekly Bible study this past week.
One of our many Heiser moments?
Yes. It's like we ring the bell every week for the Mike Heiser reference. The parable Jesus gave of the ruler who goes away to foreign land in the wine press, and he sends his servants back to, and the tenants beat him up, and then they kill one, and then he sends his son, and they kill him.
Isn't it interesting, the tenant language there?
Yeah, so essentially, because I had always thought, well, this is talking about the Israelites beating up and killing the prophets, but is there a deeper meaning there?
Yeah, I think there is, because the day of the Lord, the resolution of the exile, the end of the tribulation, and the coming of Messiah, of course, in our context, it's the second coming. They not only include all 12 tribes. Okay, this is from Hosea chapter 2, Hosea 1 and 2. It includes Gentiles as well. This is why Paul, when he quotes Hosea chapter 2 about, my people, not my people, and all that, Paul swaps in the Gentiles for the lost tribes, because in Hosea 1, he's included the Gentiles in that vision. That whole, this is what's going to happen. So when you go to a parable like that, you have to view it against the larger picture of Old Testament theology. The Gentile nations are always part of this regathering thing. It's not only Jews. This is what Paul refers to as the fullness of the Gentiles. Well, when the fullness of the Gentiles happens, then we'll go back to Israel, and all Israel will be saved.
Specifically, want to talk about Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 4, which has been de-supernaturalized or de-mythologized over the centuries. And this can lead to some really different interpretations about what God was telling Moses about that, or what had been handed down to Moses through the histories that he was familiar with. For people who aren't familiar with the passages we're talking about, what do they describe, and what do most Bible scholars or commentators, how do they view the passage?
Yeah, there are lots of buckets for this one that you could throw it in. For those who aren't familiar with the passage, this is the old sons of God saw the daughters of men, took them wives of all they wanted to, and had children, because really odd offspring, the Nephilim, okay, the men of renown, okay, the giants. So this has been one of the more vexing passages for Old Testament scholars and just Bible readers for a long time. And scholars, tend to throw it in a bunch of buckets. There are those who would just say, okay, this is what it says. We take it at face value, but it's pure mythology. It has no relationship at all to reality. The Christian scholar, though, predominantly, goes down a different road. They can't really say, well, here's something in the Bible that, is just a bunch of hokum. So they have to do something with it. And so the natural tendency is to demythologize it or strip it of its supernatural qualities.
Can I ask you really quickly to clarify when you say mythology? I think most people assume mythology means it's made up.
You know, in the academic sense, myth is, as an academic term, just, you know, doing academic stuff, speaking academese now. Myth is a story in which some of the main characters are divine beings. They're not humans. So you could say, well, the Bible is full of mythic stuff. And it is, because God's like the center stage actor in so much of it. So you can use a term like mythic in that sense. And if you're in a room full of academics, well, they're going to kind of know what you mean. But if you're not, you start using words like mythic and mythological, they're going to just make it sound like, okay, you mean it's a cartoon.
Yeah.
Okay, that sort of thing. So there's a difference there, and it depends on the context and, you know, what the person's thinking and what you're hearing and all that. But because of that, Christian scholars have tended to, again, want to normalize the passage. They want to just make it, oh, well, it seems to suggest this, again, this divine human transgression thing, okay? And you will find those themes in other literature, you know, mythic literature or mythological literature, and they'll say, well, it can't be that. Okay, so it must be something else. And the something else is typically to take the sons of God and make them just normal people. And this is where the sons of Seth idea, so the dominant approach within evangelicalism is that what we have here are two lines. The godly line of Seth, those are the sons of God. And the women in the story are the sons of Cain, the line of Cain. Well, the text never actually says that, but if you make it two lines, then they're both human, and oh, well, that's the end of that problem. Of course, then you have to do something with the offspring. And so this is where we get the tendency to look at a term like Nephilim and kind of disregard the fact that every ancient translator, whether it was the Greeks producing the Septuagint in between the Testaments, the Greek translation of the Old Testament, or later on, you know, when the Old Testament is put into Aramaic, all of those, you know, traditions, at least the Greek traditions, would use gigantes, giant. And a lot of the Targums, again, are not fudging this either. A lot of the Aramaic translations, they're kind of uneven. Some do, some don't. But when you're talking about the Septuagint, which was the Bible of the early church, which was the Bible most of the time that the New Testament quotes when the apostles or Jesus quote the Old Testament, they're using the Septuagint. That's gigantes. Okay, that's giants. And so you'd have to ask yourself the question, well, why did they look at this word and think that thought, as opposed to, again, modern evangelicals will look at that word and say, oh, it means fallen ones, like warriors fallen in battle. Well, the answer is because that helps you to normalize it. It helps you to take all the characters in the story and just make them normal people. There's nothing odd going on here, nothing supernatural going on here. You know, just keep walking, citizen. There's nothing to see here. It's just one of those things, you know, but there's this impulse, and I'm not saying it's sinister. I am saying it's incorrect for some really fundamental reasons, but it's not sinister because people who do this tend to think, well, I need to do this to protect the Bible, you know, against this mythological charge. So they do it.
That's an interesting viewpoint. Okay, God is incapable of making the Bible clear and consistent, so I'm going to help him out.
Yeah, or the supernatural might scare people, so let's not make it too supernatural. You know, and what's so normal about the virgin birth? Okay, to use your opening, you know, we're Christians. We affirm the fact that there's a God. You know, Christian you're Trinitarian, which means you have to affirm the incarnation, the virgin birth. What's so normal about that stuff? And when you really think about it, there's nothing normal about that stuff.
Right. Well, a friend of ours, Guy Malone, made a really interesting observation once. He said, look, the price of admission to this club that we call Christians is believing that a Jewish carpenter literally rose from the dead, and it's supposed to make more sense from there?
Yep. God passes through the birth canal, you know. I mean, this is what you're saying, and Christians, well, of course we're saying that because that's important. That's what we believe. But a passage like Genesis 6, you know, first 4 verses becomes peripheral, since it's not tied into, or at least people think, anything else. And it's tied into a lot, actually. But even if you know that, well, there's no major doctrinal point here being made. So we can strip the supernatural out of this one and we're okay. And then it goes back to this, well, we kind of need to do this, because then the Bible, starts to have a relationship religiously to some other ideas. Well, it's like, hey, newsflash, people in the ancient world were not like us. They were not predisposed to not believe in the supernatural. Okay, they were predisposed to believe the supernatural. And if you as a Christian believe there's a God who actually interacts with people, did and does, then it's not so much of a leap. What about the cohabitation? And if you take the literal cohabitation view, well, it just says that divine beings could take upon themselves human flesh, and flesh does what it does. They don't have to eat, but they do that. They wrestle with people. They don't have to take bodies. They could just show up visually, but they don't. So again, they're very simple ideas that when you really think about them, it's like, well, yeah, that we would expect a divine being, a God, to be able to do something. And this doesn't seem like such a tall order as opposed to like creation. So what's the problem? And again, the problem is going back to this whole, I think, confusion of mythic and mythology and all that, because unbelievers love to throw rocks at the Bible for things like that.
Yeah, you believe in floating axe heads and talking donkeys and giants who walked the earth back in the day.
I just wanted to just stay on this just for a second. Since the original language doesn't mention the Cain line and the Seth line, how did that get started?
Well, it gets started because of the assumption that Genesis 6:1 through 4 is sort of building off Genesis 5, where you get genealogies, and other genealogies where you do have a line of Seth and a line of Cain in different biblical genealogies in different passages. And so I hate to put it this way, but this is kind of the scholarly truth here. Hey, we don't really know what to do with the first 4 verses. So they're about like intermarriage, so that must be genealogy talk. So we take it back to that. Again, that becomes the justification, even though none of the wording is like the standard genealogies. No. You don't have any of that. You don't have the line of Cain specifically mentioned. And why is it that all the line of Cain are the bad guys? And why are they all women? I mean, you start asking questions like this, but to me, even that's peripheral. I think the real issue is, why didn't Peter and Jude take your view?
Good one.
Pastor. Why didn't they take your view? Because they don't.
Well, let's explore that. Where do Peter and Jude draw their material from? Because it seems to me that there's some things that they draw upon, talking about the angels who were punished for not keeping their first estate. That is outside the Bible. But I guess the bigger question is,
it's out and in.
Yeah. and why did they do it? What was so important about interpreting these first 4 passages literally and taking and incorporating that in the biblical narrative, the intermarriage, the interbreeding of angels and humans?
Yeah, I mean, Peter and Jude both draw on this episode in their talk about false teachers. And there's a reason for that, because associated with this event in intertestamental Jewish literature comes with it the idea of false teaching, that the Watchers, again, to use the intertestamental, the Enochian language for the sons of God, were teaching things that, were opposed to the truth that God wanted humans to have. And so there's a natural connection in the mind of the New Testament writer between, to use Peter's phrase, the angels that sinned and false teaching. So they become a convenient analogy to address false teaching. But back to the question about, well, what about these other sources? I mean, there are a couple of very clear indications that Peter telegraphs what he's thinking about, and Jude the same way, angels that sinned. Okay, angels who are kept in gloomy darkness in chains. Okay, these phrases. In the Greek text, one of the passages has basically sent to Tartarus. Okay, went to Hades, the chains of gloomy darkness. The Greek verb there was tartarao, which actually meant something to a Greek. It doesn't really mean anything to us because we don't translate it that way. But this tells you that they're thinking about not only something that our Old Testament records, this event, because there is no other angelic sin in the Old Testament. There just isn't. People say, well, what about the third of the angels, being swept down before creation? And guess what? There's no passage in the Bible that says that. The closest you get is Revelation 12.
Which post-dates
Right.
Peter and Jude.
And it's associated with the first coming of Jesus. Now that, the last time I checked history, that was after the creation.
Yes.
Yeah.
So there is no other candidate for this angelic sin. So Peter and Jude are just telling you point blank, this is what they're there's only one thing that they can be thinking of. In between the Testaments, though, you get a lot of Jewish writing interpretation of Genesis 6, 1 through 4. Now, I'm working on another book presently about what was the original context for Genesis 6, 1 through 4. And that takes you back to Mesopotamia. And that material was known to the Jewish writers in between the Testaments, which is where they get it from. So they're actually drawing on elements of an original thing that the writer of Genesis was shooting at. They're aware of what that thing was. And that kind of leaks into their own writing. And by doing that, they preserve it. And then they use it in the New Testament, because the whole idea of being imprisoned in darkness, you don't get that in Genesis 6, back in the Hebrew Bible.
Right.
You do get it in intertestamental period. And in the original story, the Mesopotamian story that Genesis is shooting at, you get it there too. Now you get hints of it in passages like Ezekiel 32, where you have the Rephaim, again, the vestiges, the descendants of the Nephilim through the Anakim are in Sheol, they're in the underworld. So you get hints of it there. But you don't get a verse that says, oh, and by the way, after this event, God was angry and he sent them to Sheol. You don't get a verse that says that, but you get them present in that place later on. So this extra tradition we think of as intertestamental, that doesn't count because it's not biblical. Well, it's actually very consistent with things you do get in the Old Testament in other passages about these descendants winding up in this place. It's actually very consistent across the board.
Mike, in intertestamental literature, things that were part of the Jewish consciousness, Jewish theology, between the end of the Old Testament and the opening of the book of Matthew.
Why should we care?
It's not in our Bibles. Why should we care?
Is that to 21st century American Christianity? Why does it matter?
Yeah, well, believe it or not, the people who wrote the Bible read things. Okay, they actually read. They were readers, just like you and I are. And when they read something, they sometimes found it useful to talk about some other thing. And again, this is just what we do. I like to use the illustration, look, in a Reformed context, a Calvinistic context, you'd be trained in seminary, hey, go read John Calvin's commentary on Romans or read Calvin's Institutes or something like that. Well, you're going to find that valuable, again, within your tradition when you go to interpret Romans or you go to interpret some other passage. You're going to have Calvin in your head. And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, I would suggest you need to work in the original text, but hey, he might say something that really captures a point very well. And you could bring that into the pulpit and it helps you communicate an idea in a sermon or a lesson or whatever. It's the same thing with New Testament writers. They read a lot of material. And a book like what we call Book of Enoch, First Enoch in academic parlance, that was widely read. It shows up in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's quoted in other material. People knew what that book was about, and similar books. And the New Testament writers, Peter and Jude, are the best examples, but there are actually a number of other examples throughout the New Testament where you can tell, again, if you know what you're looking for, and if you know the Enoch stuff well, you know that they're tracking on something here. They read that and they found it useful. It doesn't have to be inspired to be useful. It's just, well, okay, I got this floating around in my head and I want to talk about this point about the angels that sinned, and okay, I know just how to word this because this writer over here really said it well. So I'm going to use that. That'll help me communicate. That's all that's going on in Peter and Jude. It's very normal for writers to do that.
The ancient world had a lot more interaction between the various cultures than most of us realize. I've heard a scholar describe it as specialists in ancient cultures tend to work inside like their own little cubby hole, and you'll get experts in ancient Egypt and ancient Assyria and the ancient Hittites, but they don't really know what's going on in the other fields, and you have to kind of stand back and look at it. I was surprised to learn recently that Tutankhamun actually had beadwork in his, mummy wrappings that came from Scandinavia, and they've proven this by chemically analyzing the stones. How much of what the Mesopotamians were thinking, the Babylonians, the Akkadians, the Canaanites, found its way into what the ancient Jewish writers and Hebrew prophets were aware of?
Yeah, in the literate class, the scribes, you would have sort of direct contact with other literature, because not only are you bringing trade goods, consumables, with you from one place to the other and then exchanging, but they would also bring texts. They would also bring physical material parts of books, tablets, whatever, because you were keeping a library. Just again, what we do today, it's not any different than what's happening today. And the scribes would store that away. If you were a literate person and could read that material, and in most of the biblical days, Akkadian was kind of like English is today. Everybody had to know Akkadian. It was the language of international correspondence. So this is why the letters from the Pharaoh in Egypt during the Amarna period are written in Akkadian to people in Palestine.
The diplomatic language.
Right, it's a diplomatic language.
Well, it used to be French and now it's English.
Right. So they had the same thing going on there. But if you were educated, well educated, you would know a few of these languages because that was the tool of your trade. Again, you were a scribe. This is what you do. Now, informally, if you were not, literate, you would hear ideas passed on by the people you met. Okay, hey, I met this guy down by the shipyard, and he's from, Anatolia, and he was talking about this, his god, this or that, deity did this or that, and you get into these conversations about the circumstances of life and how they looked at the world, and of course for them the world, the supernatural interacts with what they're doing all the time, positive and negative, and so you hear about things, and so there's some cross-fertilization in an informal way too.
I guess just to bring this home with just about 5 minutes left here, the understanding the ancient Jewish understanding or concept of the Nephilim, Anakim, Rephaim, why is a supernatural understanding of that story necessary for Christians? How does that impact the concepts of sin and salvation?
That's an excellent question. On one level, we've talked about one element, and that is, look, if you want to be able to say Peter and Jude were correct, in other words, I don't have to correct them, okay, then you're going to go with what they say. So that's a fundamental issue for bibliology. But beyond that, we're trained as Christians to think one way about kind of our circumstances, and sin you brought up very directly relates to this, whereas an ancient person thought a little bit differently about it. Here's what I mean. If you walked up to the average Christian today and said, hey, why is the world the way it is? Why do we have human depravity? What happened? If the creation story, everybody was kind of had a relationship with God and it just went terribly wrong so fast. How did that happen? Well, the average Christian would say, oh, that's the fall. It's Genesis 3. Okay, a Second Temple Jew, again, living in Jesus' time, would not say that. A Second Temple Jew would say, well, there's basically three reasons. There's not just one, there's three. One is the fall. The other, when we know that sin enters the world there, we have the first rebellion, humans rebel, the divine rebellion, that's where it all gets started. But then we have Genesis 6:1-4. And because of what happened there, we have, remember Genesis 6:5, the wickedness of man was great on the earth. Well, there's a whole set of ideas, again, in the period of Jesus' day, that blames the watchers, blames the sons of God who violated God's boundary rule here between heaven and earth, and taught humanity all sorts of things that corrupted them. So a first century Jew would be thinking, that's part of why the world is as bad as it is, because of what happened there. Because we had another divine rebellion, and it made us even more wicked. They manipulated us. And then the third is the Babel event. This is, going back to this concept of cosmic geography, when God punishes the nations by assigning them to the sons of God, and the other sons of God become corrupt. So a first century Jew would say, we're just messed up, not just for one reason, but for all three of these things. And what the church has done is the church has defaced, really eviscerated Genesis 6. So that is out of the picture. And you never really learn about what You never really learn about Deuteronomy 32, 8, and 9 when it comes to Babel. You just learn the story. But the supernatural element of that is taken away too.
Right.
So the big answer is there's 3 events in the Old Testament that amount to divine acts of rebellion and human acts of rebellion, and the fallout, pardon the pun, of all 3 are why humanity is just in such a mess. And when the Messiah comes, here's why it's a big part of this that's really missed. They believe that when the Messiah would come, he would reverse all these things, not just Genesis 3. Okay, Jesus is, of course, the answer to the problem of death. Okay, Genesis 3, okay? Resurrection. But he's also the answer to the infection of humanity by evil, by these other divine rebellions. And there are things in the Gospels, in the book of Acts, in the epistles, that draw on this idea of messianic reversal of these other 2 things too, that we never get to in our theology. So if you want to have a fuller understanding of who you are, what the mess you're in is, and what Jesus was about, you need this other stuff.
And that's a perfect setup because you're working on a book dealing with that concept of this supernatural reversal of what the ancient
the whole importance of that for New Testament theology. You never get there.
Well, we will have you back when that book comes out because that's going to be another fascinating set of discussions. Just within, say, with just a minute to go, again, where should people start if they want to get a better, deeper understanding of the importance of the Genesis 6 event?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, you know, the cheesy answer is read my book. You know, The Unseen Realm. But to be honest with that's why I wrote it, because I'm trying to take, again, the academic discussion and make it decipherable to just the normal person who's interested, the person outside the guild. Because there's just a lot of material that you never hear about in church or Bible study or whatever. And when you do hear about it, it's often sort of caricatured, you know, in some other source. So that's why the book exists. And I would say if you have a good amount of Bible under your belt, you know, you're not a new Christian, that's a really good place to start. Because I devote 5 chapters to Genesis 6 and then Nephilim descendants and all that stuff in that book.